What is supposed to be the big moral difference here? I've asked that question often. My colleagues, other philosophers, academics writing in academic journals have sometimes tried to address it, but I have yet to see a really convincing answer. I mean, what you start off with, well, the children in developing countries are far away from us. But why should that make a difference? I mean, why should geography make a difference? Don't we really believe that the lives of people in developing countries are equally important to the lives of people here? It doesn't seem that distance makes any difference. What about this point that other people could say? Well, of course they could. And some of them are. Some people are giving substantially to these organisations, fortunately. That's why they're able to do the work that they can do. But we also know that not enough people are giving to them. And as I said, that number, the latest UNICEF figure of about 8 million children, that's children under 5 dying each year from poverty-related causes, is a figure that's been dropping over the years. I have a book on this topic called The Life You Can Save, published in 2009. And when I did that, the figure was close to 10 million when I sent the original hardback to press. There's now a paperback out. When I revised the paperback, it had dropped to 8.8 million. It's only in a couple of years. And now, a year later, it's dropped to just above 8 million. So we are making progress on this. But it's obvious that we're not making progress fast enough, or we would have got rid of those. These are all preventable, avoidable deaths. They're not deaths from strange diseases that we don't know how to cure. They're deaths from things like measles, which we can vaccinate against, malaria, where we can protect against with bed nets, or treat, diarrhea, which we can prevent with sanitation, or treat very inexpensively, and so on. So, yes, we're making progress. Don't believe the stories that say aid is not effective, because I think that progress is at least in part due to aid. Sometimes some of it's in part due to economic development, that may be due to trade as well. I'm not saying that aid is all of the story, but I do think that it does make, there's good evidence that makes a difference. But we should be doing more. So the fact that other people could be doing more isn't really relevant if your donation would still make a difference. I mean, if other people were going to save all the children in need of saving, that would be fine. Suppose, to go back to the pond, there was not one child in the pond, but 10. But when you looked up, you saw 10 people all running down the pond. Then I guess you could reasonably say, well, I don't need to ruin my shoes, because there's 10 people all about to leap into the pond, and there's only 10 children, each of them will grab one, fine. But if you imagine that although there are some other people helping, there are still some children who are dying because nobody is helping them. And even if there were other people around not helping, if you were aware that the children would die, or at least one child would die unless you go into the pond and save one child, I think it's clear that still that's what you ought to do. You shouldn't make an excuse, well, other people are not doing this, I'm no worse than they are. Maybe you're not worse than they are, but you're certainly not better than they are. And you really ought to be better than they are in this situation. So that's why I do think that we are under a moral obligation to do something about global poverty, as we would be under a moral obligation if we passed the child on in this sense. I think that's something that we can ourselves make a difference about. Of course, you might say, well, look, shouldn't the government be doing something about this? The government does do something about it. The government does give some aid. The amount of aid the British government gives is not as high as the amount of the governments of Norway and Sweden and Denmark and Luxembourg and the Netherlands give. There, I think the only nation, sadly, that have reached or exceeded the United Nations suggested target of 0.7% of gross domestic product. Britain has pledged to get there in a few years, and that's a good thing. But even if it does get there, we're talking about 70 pence in every £100 that the nation earns. We can do better than that. So until the government and other governments do enough, I think we ought to be saying, look, I will campaign for governments to do more. That's what I support. But I will also make my own contribution to do something. Because not to do so would simply be the wrong thing to do. It would be to say, I'm not prepared to value the life of another child as much as I value some of these things that I spend my money on, which, as I've said, are not really things of great significance. So, I believe that this is one of the great moral challenges that face us in the world. One of the wrongs in the world that the affluent are doing so little for the global poor. I think it's a soluble problem. It would not actually take a vast amount of resources. Some people think, well, this is sort of a bottomless pit. We've just got to keep pouring resources into, and we don't get anywhere. In fact, levels of aid have never been really high in terms of a percentage of income of the wealthy nations. You sometimes see figures, there's a book by an economist called William Easterly published a few years ago called The White Man's Burden, where he said the West has put trillions of dollars of aid into developing countries, and yet they're still poor. But then when you look at what he was talking about, yes, the West, I thought, I think it was about 2 trillion, so it's trillions, just. But it's over 50 years that he was talking about. So for all of the developed nations, all of the rich nations, over 50 years, to put $2 trillion worth of aid, as a percentage of what those nations earn, I think the rich nations each year earn 20-something, I can't remember, 24 or something trillion dollars, that's their GDP. So it's not as even as if 1 year or even 1/10 perhaps of the earnings of the rich nations in 1 year has over 50 years gone to the poor nations. And when you divide it up by the 1.4 billion, you get to some really fairly insignificant amount of aid per person in poverty that's been given, maybe $20 a head or something like that. So it's not really as if we've been putting large amounts of money into it. And a number of people who've looked at this, Jeffrey Sachs, for example, is an economist from Columbia University and has been a special advisor to Kofi Annan when he was Secretary General of the UN. He estimates that it would be something under 2% of gross national product would be enough to meet the Millennium Development Goals, which were goals for reducing poverty, which were supposed to be pledged to meet by 2015, and could go on to do much more than that even to reduce global poverty. So while we might feel that it's burdensome for each one of us to give a substantial amount, if we were all giving, the amount would not be so great. And I think it's something that the economies of the wealthy nations can quite easily withstand. So I don't want to go on much longer. I'm sure you're eager to listen to Toby Ord, who has a lot to say about giving what we can and what we can do in this area. But the argument I put is simply to say this really is a great moral challenge. It's a moral challenge that faces all of us who have some money to spare that we could help, and I hope you'll think about how you can meet this challenge yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Singer, for that absolutely excellent talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Toby Ord, who is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford and is the founder of Giving What We Can. Last year and the year before, Toby made headlines when he declared his pledge to give over half of his income to the causes that most cost-effectively fight poverty in the developing world. And he's not just doing this himself, he's convinced many people, including myself and including many members of this audience, to also donate a large proportion of their income over the course of their lives to the global poor. Giving What We Can is now a thriving and rapidly growing community, none more so than in Oxford right here. And together as a community we've pledged over $35 million to the global poor. So let's put our hands together for the next speaker, Dr. Toby Ord.